James Foster walked through the heavy wooden doors of the Boston Children's Home, a historic building that stood as a testament to resilience and hope. The grand entrance hall, with its high ceilings and intricate moldings, echoed with the sounds of children's laughter and footsteps, creating an atmosphere of warmth and life despite the gray clouds that loomed outside. James adjusted his tailored suit jacket, trying to shake off the weight of his memories as he prepared for another day of philanthropy. His foundation had been donating to various causes, but visiting orphanages always tugged at his heartstrings the most. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as he approached the front desk, where a kind-faced woman greeted him with a smile. "Mr. Foster, welcome. We're so grateful for your support," she said warmly, extending her hand. "Thank you," James replied, shaking her hand. "I'm looking forward to meeting the children." The woman led James down a long corridor lined with framed photographs of past benefactors and smiling children, their eyes filled with hope and dreams. As they walked, James couldn't help but think of his own son, whose infectious laughter used to fill his home. They entered a bright, sunlit room where children were engaged in various activities, painting, reading, and playing with toys. James's eyes scanned the room, landing on a boy sitting quietly in the corner, engrossed in a book. Something about the boy's posture and the way he tilted his head struck a familiar chord in James's heart. "Who is that boy?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, that's Lucas," the woman replied. "He's a bit shy but very bright. He's been here for about a year now." James nodded, unable to tear his gaze away from Lucas. The boy looked up, sensing he was being watched, and their eyes met. James felt his breath catch in his throat. Lucas's eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were the exact shade of blue as his late son's. The resemblance was uncanny, almost painful. With a gentle push from the woman, James approached Lucas. "Hello there," he said softly, kneeling down to be at eye level with the boy. "What are you reading?" Lucas hesitated for a moment before showing James the cover of his book. "It's about space," he said quietly. "I love learning about the stars and planets." James smiled, memories flooding back of reading similar books with his son. "My son loved space too," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Lucas's eyes lit up. "Really? What was his favorite planet?" "Jupiter," James replied without missing a beat. He used to say that its size and the great red spot made it the coolest planet. Lucas grinned, a smile so familiar it sent a pang of longing through James's heart. "I think Saturn is the best, with all its rings," Lucas said enthusiastically. As they talked, James felt a connection forming, something deep and almost inexplicable. He noticed how Lucas's gestures and expressions mirrored those of his son, making him feel as if a piece of his lost family had been returned to him. The woman from the front desk joined them, a look of curiosity on her face. "Lucas, this is Mr. Foster. He's been helping our home a lot." Lucas's eyes widened with awe. "Thank you, Mr. Foster. It's really nice here because of people like you." James felt a lump form in his throat. "It's my pleasure, Lucas. People like you make it all worthwhile." The conversation drifted to other topics, but James's mind was racing. He needed to know more about Lucas, where he came from, how he ended up here. The eerie similarities between Lucas and his son were too significant to ignore. As James prepared to leave, he promised Lucas he would visit again soon. The boy's hopeful expression and heartfelt goodbye tugged at his heartstrings, making him more determined than ever to uncover the truth. Leaving the orphanage, James felt a whirlwind of emotions: hope, sorrow, curiosity, and a burgeoning sense of purpose. He knew that this encounter was more than mere coincidence. It was a destined meeting that would lead him on a path of discovery and, possibly, healing. James Foster sat alone in his opulent study, the dim light from the antique lamp casting long shadows on the rich mahogany walls. The room, adorned with leather-bound books and framed accolades, felt cold and empty despite its luxury. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on a family photo on his desk, a candid shot of his wife, Sarah, and their young son, Daniel, laughing together at the beach. The image blurred as tears welled up in his eyes, pulling him into the vortex of painful memories. The sound of crashing waves filled his ears as the scene shifted to a sunny day at the beach. Sarah's golden hair shimmered in the sunlight as she chased Daniel, whose infectious giggles echoed above the roar of the ocean. James watched them with a smile, capturing the moment on his camera. "Come on, Daddy. Join us," Daniel called, his small hands waving enthusiastically. "Just a minute, champ. Let me get this perfect shot," James replied, adjusting the camera lens. He finally set the camera down and ran towards them, feeling the warmth of the sand under his feet and the cool breeze on his face. The memory shifted, and James found himself driving on a winding road. Sarah beside him and Daniel in the backseat, chattering about the day's adventures. The sky darkened suddenly, heavy rain pelting the windshield. James tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his heart pounding. "James, slow down. The roads are slippery," Sarah urged, her voice tinged with worry. "I got this, Sarah. Don't worry," James reassured her, forcing a smile. But the rain intensified, visibility dropping to almost nothing. A flash of headlights blinded him. The sound of screeching tires, the shattering of glass, and the gut-wrenching crunch of metal filled the air. James felt the world spin as the car tumbled off the road. Then, there was silence, broken only by the sound of rain. James woke up in a hospital bed, his body aching, his head bandaged. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils. He looked around frantically, his eyes searching for Sarah and Daniel. "Mr. Foster, you need to stay calm," a nurse said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're going to be okay." "Where's my family? Where are Sarah and Daniel?" James demanded, his voice breaking. The nurse hesitated, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Foster. They didn't make it." James felt the room spin again, this time with the weight of unimaginable grief. He screamed, a primal sound of pain and loss, echoing through the sterile hospital corridor. Back in his study, James's hands trembled as he placed the photo back on his desk. The guilt of that day never left him. He blamed himself for not heeding Sarah's warning, for not being more cautious. He relived the accident over and over, each time wondering what he could have done differently. The sound of a knock on the door pulled him back to the present. It was Emily Collins, his childhood friend and confidant, now a successful attorney. Her presence was a rare comfort in his life. "James, I brought you some dinner. You need to eat," she said softly, placing a takeout bag on the desk. Her dark eyes, filled with concern, met his. "Thanks, Emily. I'm not really hungry," he replied, his voice hollow. "James, you can't keep doing this to yourself. Sarah and Daniel wouldn't want you to live like this," Emily said, sitting across from him. "They loved you. It was an accident." James shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I was driving, Emily. I should have been more careful. I should have listened to Sarah. Blaming yourself won't bring them back. You have to find a way to move forward, to honor their memory by living," Emily insisted, reaching out to hold his hand. James squeezed her hand, grateful for her support but unable to let go of the guilt. "I don't know how, Emily. I don't know if I can." "You can, James. You're stronger than you think, and you're not alone. I'm here with you," she said firmly, her grip on his hand tightening. James looked into her eyes, seeing the unwavering determination there. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but with Emily by his side, he might find a way to forgive himself and start anew. The room, once a sanctuary of his achievements, now held the promise of healing. The journey ahead was uncertain, but James realized he needed to take the first step, for himself, for Sarah and Daniel, and for the future he could still shape. James Foster couldn't shake the uncanny feeling that washed over him every time he saw Lucas. The boy's features, his piercing blue eyes, the way his hair fell into his face, even his infectious laugh, were eerily reminiscent of his late son, Daniel. It wasn't just physical. It was in the little gestures, the mannerisms that Lucas exhibited without realizing it. One sunny afternoon, James returned to the Boston Children's Home. The children were outside playing, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. James's eyes immediately sought out Lucas, who was sitting under a large oak tree, sketching something in a notebook. James approached slowly, not wanting to disturb the boy's concentration. "Hey there, Lucas," James greeted, crouching down to get a better look at the drawing. "Hi, Mr. Foster," Lucas replied with a shy smile. "I'm drawing the planets." James's heart skipped a beat. "The planets, huh? That's pretty cool. Do you like space?" Lucas nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, it's fascinating. My favorite is Saturn because of the rings." James chuckled, a bittersweet feeling washing over him. Daniel used to love space too. He was crazy about Jupiter. Lucas's eyes lit up. "Jupiter is awesome. Did you know it has a giant storm called the Great Red Spot?" "I do," James replied, smiling. Daniel loved talking about that. Lucas looked thoughtful for a moment. "You know, I remember something weird. It's like a dream, but it feels real. I remember watching a meteor shower from a hill. There was this big oak tree, and we had a picnic. We lay on a blanket, and we made wishes on shooting stars." James felt a chill run down his spine. That memory was one of his most cherished moments with Sarah and Daniel. They had gone on a picnic to watch the Perseid meteor shower, lying on a blanket under the stars, making wishes. It was a private, intimate memory, one that only his family should have known. "Lucas, can you tell me more about that dream?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lucas shrugged. "There's not much more to it. Just the feeling of being really happy and safe. And there was this song. Someone was humming it, but I can't remember how it goes." James felt his heart ache. Sarah used to hum a lullaby to Daniel every night, the same song she sang during that picnic. "Can you try to hum it for me?" Lucas hesitated, then started to hum a soft, familiar tune. James's eyes filled with tears as he recognized the melody. It was the lullaby, the exact same one. James started, but his voice caught. He took a deep breath, composing himself. "I used to sing that song to my son. It's a very special memory for me." Lucas looked up, his eyes wide with wonder. "Maybe that's why it feels so real. Like it happened to me too." James felt a mix of emotions: joy, sorrow, confusion. How could Lucas know these things? The similarities were too striking to be mere coincidence. "Lucas, would you like to spend more time together? I can teach you more about space, and maybe we can watch another meteor shower," James offered, his voice filled with hope. Lucas beamed. "I'd love that, Mr. Foster." As they continued to talk, James couldn't help but feel a growing connection with Lucas. The boy wasn't just a reminder of his lost family. He was something new, something full of potential. James felt a spark of purpose reignite within him. He was determined to uncover the truth about Lucas, to understand the mysterious bond they shared. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, James felt ready to face it. James Foster sat in the cozy, wood-paneled office of Emily Collins, his childhood friend and now a prominent attorney. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the room filled with bookshelves and framed legal certificates. Emily's desk was neatly organized, a testament to her meticulous nature. Emily, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of calm confidence, leaned back in her chair, studying James with concern. "James, you sounded urgent on the phone. What's going on?" James took a deep breath, his thoughts racing. "Emily, I need your help. It's about a boy I met at the Boston Children's Home. His name is Lucas." Emily nodded, her curiosity piqued. "Tell me more." He's incredibly similar to Daniel, not just in looks, but in mannerisms, memories, things only Daniel would know," James explained, his voice trembling slightly. Emily's eyes widened. "That's quite a claim, James. Are you sure?" "I am," James insisted. He remembered a specific memory, Emily. A picnic under the stars, the same lullaby Sarah used to hum. "It can't be a coincidence." Emily leaned forward, her interest fully captured. "All right, let's take a look at his adoption records. If there's something there, we'll find it." James felt a surge of relief. He knew Emily was the best person to help him navigate this mystery. "Thank you, Emily. I don't know what I'd do without you." Emily smiled warmly. "We've always had each other's backs, James. Remember when we used to explore the old forest behind your house? We thought we were such adventurers." James chuckled, the memory lightening his mood. "I remember. You always found the best hiding spots." They reminisced for a while, the nostalgia creating a comfortable, familiar bond between them. Then, Emily's expression grew serious again. Let's get to work. We'll start by reviewing the records at the orphanage. They drove to the Boston Children's Home together, the atmosphere filled with a mix of determination and hope. The head administrator, Mrs. Henderson, welcomed them into her office. She was a kindly woman in her late 50s, with a warm smile and kind eyes. "Mr. Foster, Miss Collins, how can I assist you today?" Mrs. Henderson asked, offering them seats. "Mrs. Henderson, we're here to inquire about a boy named Lucas. We'd like to review his adoption records," Emily said, her tone professional but polite. Mrs. Henderson's smile faltered slightly. "I'm afraid that's confidential information." James leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "Please, Mrs. Henderson, this is incredibly important. There are some striking similarities between Lucas and my late son. We just need to understand his background better." Mrs. Henderson looked between James and Emily, her resolve softening. "I understand your concern, Mr. Foster. I'll see what I can do." She retrieved a thick file from a locked cabinet and placed it on the desk. "These are Lucas's records. Please handle them with care." Emily began sifting through the documents, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. James watched anxiously, his heart pounding. "James, look at this," Emily said, pointing to a page. "Lucas was brought to the orphanage under unusual circumstances. There are gaps in his records, inconsistencies." James's mind raced. "What does it mean?" Emily shook her head, her expression thoughtful. "I'm not sure yet, but it's definitely suspicious. We'll need to dig deeper." Mrs. Henderson frowned, clearly troubled by the revelations. "I had no idea there were discrepancies in Lucas's records. I assure you, we only want the best for our children here." "We know, Mrs. Henderson," James reassured her. "We're just trying to find the truth." As they left the orphanage, Emily turned to James, her eyes filled with determination. "This is just the beginning, James. We'll get to the bottom of this." James nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. With Emily by his side, he knew they would uncover the truth about Lucas, no matter how deep they had to dig. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, James felt a glimmer of hope. James Foster sat on a weathered park bench, watching Lucas play with a soccer ball on the nearby field. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the scene, the warmth a stark contrast to the chill that gripped his heart. He had arranged this outing to spend more time with Lucas, hoping to understand the boy's uncanny connection to his own past. Lucas kicked the ball towards James, who caught it with ease. The boy ran over, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Foster, did you play soccer with your son?" James smiled, the question tugging at his heart. "Yes, Daniel and I used to play all the time. He loved it." Lucas sat down next to James, his eyes bright with curiosity. "What else did you do together?" James hesitated, then decided to share. "We used to build model rockets. Daniel loved space, just like you. We would launch them in the backyard and watch them soar into the sky." Lucas's eyes widened. "I remember doing that too. There was one rocket. It was blue and white. It went really high, but then it got stuck in a tree." James felt a shiver run down his spine. "That was Daniel's favorite rocket. How do you know about that?" Lucas looked thoughtful. "I don't know. It just feels like I was there. And there was this one time. We had a big snowstorm. We built a huge snowman in the front yard. It had a red scarf and buttons made of coal." James's heart ached as the memory resurfaced. It was a particularly fond one, a day filled with laughter and warmth despite the cold. "Lucas, that snowman. Daniel and I built it the winter before the accident. How do you remember these things?" Lucas shrugged, looking a bit puzzled. "Sometimes, I have these dreams. They feel so real. Like the time we went fishing at the lake. I caught a fish, but it slipped out of my hands and splashed back into the water. We laughed so hard." James's breath caught. That was one of Daniel's favorite stories to tell. He loved that day at the lake. The boy looked up at James, his eyes filled with a mix of confusion and understanding. "Mr. Foster, do you think maybe I knew Daniel somehow? Maybe in another life?" James struggled to find words. He placed a gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder. "I don't know, Lucas, but there's something special about you. These memories you have, they're so specific, so real. Lucas bit his lip, thinking, do you think it's possible that I could be a part of your family? Somehow. James's eyes filled with tears. I don't know how, Lucas, but it feels like you're meant to be in my life. Like you're a piece of something I lost. Lucas leaned against James, the simple gesture of trust and comfort bringing tears to James's eyes. They sat in silence for a while, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger. Mr. Foster, can we go see the stars tonight? Like you did with Daniel? Lucas asked softly. James nodded, his heart full. Of course, Lucas. We'll find a nice spot and watch the stars together. As they stood up and walked towards the car, James felt a renewed sense of hope. Lucas wasn't just a reminder of his past. He was a beacon for the future. The boy's memories, so intricately woven with those of his own family, hinted at something profound and mysterious. James was determined to uncover the truth, to understand the connection that bound them. The sun set, casting long shadows over the park, but James felt a lightness in his heart. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond his grief. Lucas had reignited a spark within him, one that promised healing and new beginnings. The journey ahead was still fraught with questions and uncertainties, but James was ready to face them, one step at a time. Emily Collins sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of documents and records. The normally tidy space was now a chaotic whirlwind of papers and files, each one meticulously examined for any clue about Lucas's past. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she flipped through yet another set of adoption papers, searching for something, anything, that could explain the mysterious connection between Lucas and James's family. James paced the room, his anxiety palpable. Emily, have you found anything yet? Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. Not yet, James, but there's something off about these records. They don't add up. Just then, Emily's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her eyes widened. It's Mrs. Henderson from the orphanage. She wants to meet. A few hours later, Emily and James arrived at the Boston Children's Home. Mrs. Henderson greeted them, her expression tense and worried. Thank you for coming. Please, follow me to my office. Once inside, Mrs. Henderson closed the door and took a deep breath. I've been reviewing our records since your last visit. I found some discrepancies that I can't explain. Emily leaned forward, her interest piqued. What kind of discrepancies? Mrs. Henderson handed Emily a file. Lucas's file shows he was brought to us by a woman claiming to be his aunt. But there's no documentation to verify her identity. No birth certificate, no legal papers, nothing. And the woman disappeared shortly after dropping him off. James's heart raced. What do you mean, disappeared? Mrs. Henderson looked grave. She gave us a fake name and address. We tried to follow up, but there was no trace of her. Emily frowned, flipping through the file. This is highly irregular. There should be a paper trail, even in cases of emergency placement. James felt a surge of anger and frustration. Why wasn't this investigated sooner? Mrs. Henderson shook her head. We did what we could with the resources we had. But now that you've brought this to light, it seems more urgent than ever. Emily looked up, her eyes sharp. We need to talk to someone who was here when Lucas was brought in. Someone who might remember more details. Mrs. Henderson nodded. There is one person, a maintenance worker named George. He's been here for years and knows everything that goes on. But he's reluctant to talk. Determined, James and Emily found George in the maintenance shed. The old man was fixing a broken chair, his weathered hands moving skillfully over the wood. He glanced up as they approached, his eyes wary. George, we need to talk to you about Lucas, Emily said, her tone firm but respectful. George grunted, not looking up from his work. I don't know anything. Please, George, James pleaded. This is important. We need to know about the woman who brought him here. George sighed heavily, finally meeting their gaze. Look, I don't want any trouble, but I did see something that day. The woman who brought Lucas, she was scared, kept looking over her shoulder like she was being followed. Emily's eyes narrowed. Did she say anything? Give any indication of who she might be? George hesitated, then nodded. She mentioned a name. Martin. Said he would come looking for the boy. James felt a chill run down his spine. Martin? Did she say who he was? George shook his head. No, but she was terrified. After she left, I saw a man hanging around the orphanage a few times. Never came inside, just watched from a distance. Emily exchanged a look with James, the urgency of the situation becoming clear. We need to find this Martin. He might be the key to understanding Lucas's past. George nodded. Be careful. If this woman was that scared, there's a reason. You might be stirring up something dangerous. As they left the maintenance shed, James felt a mix of fear and determination. They had a name, Martin, and a new lead to follow. The puzzle pieces were slowly coming together, but with each piece, the picture grew darker and more complex. Emily turned to James, her eyes filled with resolve. We're getting closer, James, but we need to be prepared for whatever we uncover. This isn't just about Lucas anymore. It's about exposing the truth, no matter how deep it goes. James nodded, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. The stakes were higher than ever, but he was ready to face them head-on. With Emily's help, he was determined to uncover the secrets of the past and bring justice to Lucas and his family. James Foster and Emily Collins sat in Emily's office, the air thick with tension. Papers and documents were spread out across the desk, each one a piece of the puzzle they were desperately trying to solve. Emily's eyes were sharp with determination as she examined another file, while James's face was etched with worry and resolve. Look at this, Emily said, handing James a document. This is the third case we've found where the adoption records are incomplete or falsified, and all the children were brought in under suspicious circumstances. James scanned the document, his anger growing. How could this have gone unnoticed for so long? These are children we're talking about, Emily? Emily nodded, her jaw set. It looks like someone has been covering their tracks very carefully, but we're starting to see a pattern. All these children, including Lucas, were brought in by different people, all with fake identities. It suggests a coordinated effort. They spent hours cross-referencing names, dates, and places, slowly uncovering the extent of the corruption. Every new lead seemed to point them in the direction of a shadowy figure known as Martin. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Martin was at the center of a network of illegal adoptions. One evening, as the sky darkened outside Emily's office window, James slammed a file shut in frustration. We need more than just these papers, Emily. We need proof, something concrete that ties Martin to these crimes. Emily leaned back in her chair, deep in thought. There's one person who might help us, an old contact of mine in law enforcement. He's been investigating child trafficking for years. If anyone can help us, it's him. The next day, they met with Detective Mark Harris in a dimly lit cafe. Harris was a seasoned detective, his face lined with years of chasing criminals. He listened intently as Emily and James laid out their findings. This is serious, Harris said, his voice gravelly. I've heard whispers about a network like this, but I've never had enough evidence to go after them. If what you're saying is true, this could blow the whole operation wide open. James felt a glimmer of hope. Can you help us? We need to find this Martin and bring him to justice. Harris nodded. I'll put out feelers, see what I can dig up. But you two need to be careful. If this network is as extensive as it seems, you could be in real danger. Days turned into weeks as Harris worked behind the scenes, feeding Emily and James bits of information. They discovered that Martin wasn't just a single individual but part of a larger syndicate involved in human trafficking and illegal adoptions. The syndicate operated with ruthless efficiency, using fake identities and forged documents to move children across state lines and even internationally. Emily and James's investigation took them to rundown neighborhoods, abandoned warehouses, and hidden offices. Each location brought them closer to understanding the scale of the operation. They uncovered secret ledgers detailing transactions and correspondence between members of the syndicate, all pointing back to Martin as the key player. One night, as they sifted through a particularly damning set of documents, Emily's phone buzzed. It was a message from Harris. Got a lead. Meet me at the old factory on the edge of town. Come alone. James and Emily exchanged worried glances, but knew they had no choice. They arrived at the factory, a dilapidated building that stood as a relic of the past. Harris was waiting for them, his face grim. "I've got good news and bad news," Harris said. "The good news is, we have enough to arrest Martin and several key members of the syndicate. The bad news is, they know we're onto them. We have to move fast." As Harris led them inside, James's heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination. They descended into the bowels of the factory, where Harris revealed a hidden room filled with computers, files, and surveillance equipment. It was the nerve center of the syndicate's operations. "We've got them," Harris said, a rare smile crossing his face. "This is the proof we need." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the factory. Harris drew his gun, motioning for James and Emily to stay back. "Stay here. I'll handle this." Minutes felt like hours as they waited in tense silence. Finally, Harris returned, his face flushed with adrenaline. "We need to go. Now." They hurried out of the factory, sirens wailing in the distance. James felt a surge of relief and anxiety. They had uncovered the truth, but the fight was far from over. The syndicate was vast and dangerous, and they had just declared war on it. As they drove away, Emily turned to James, her eyes filled with determination. "We're not done yet, James. This is just the beginning. We have to see this through, for Lucas and all the other children." James nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. They had taken the first step in dismantling a dark network of corruption and exploitation. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but he knew they couldn't stop now. The lives of countless children depended on their courage and tenacity. James and Emily sat in a small, dimly lit cafe, the air thick with the smell of coffee and a hint of something more sinister. They were waiting for their contact, a man who had agreed to meet them in exchange for protection. The tension between them was palpable as they silently sipped their drinks, their minds racing with the implications of their investigation. The door creaked open, and a tall, wiry man with a weathered face and nervous eyes walked in. He scanned the room before making his way to their table. This was Alex, a former employee at the Boston Children's Home who had crucial information about the illegal adoption network. "Alex, thank you for meeting with us," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need your help to uncover the truth about this network." Alex glanced around the cafe, his paranoia evident. "I don't have much time. They're watching me. But you need to know what's really going on." James leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Tell us everything you know. We can protect you." Alex took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly. "It started about 5 years ago. I noticed some irregularities in the adoption records, but whenever I brought it up, I was told to keep quiet. Then, I saw children being taken away by people who weren't their legal guardians. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how deep it went." Emily nodded, encouraging him to continue. "We found evidence of forged documents and false identities. Can you confirm this?" "Yes," Alex replied, his voice trembling. "Martin, the man in charge, he's ruthless. He controls everything. The fake identities, the illegal transfers, he's got connections everywhere. The children are taken to different states, sometimes even other countries. It's all very organized." James felt a surge of anger. "And Lucas? How did he end up at the orphanage?" Alex looked at James, sympathy in his eyes. "Lucas was brought in by a woman claiming to be his aunt, but it was all a lie. She was working for Martin. I overheard her talking to him on the phone. She said they had to get rid of the boy quickly because he was drawing too much attention." Emily's eyes widened. "Drawing too much attention? What do you mean?" "He started remembering things, talking about his real family," Alex explained. "Martin didn't want anyone investigating, so they fabricated his entire background. The woman disappeared soon after, and Lucas was left at the orphanage with no trace of his past." James's heart pounded in his chest. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" "I was scared," Alex admitted, his voice cracking. "Martin has eyes and ears everywhere. People who cross him don't last long. But when I heard you were looking into Lucas's past, I knew I had to help." Emily placed a reassuring hand on Alex's arm. "You're doing the right thing, Alex. We're getting closer to bringing Martin down, but we need more. Do you have any documents or evidence that can tie him directly to these crimes?" Alex nodded, pulling a small flash drive from his pocket. "This has everything. Emails, transaction records, names of people involved. It's all there. James took the flash drive, feeling a mix of relief and determination. Thank you, Alex. This is what we need to finally stop Martin. Suddenly, Alex's eyes widened in fear. We have to go. Now. They're here. Emily and James turned to see two men in dark suits entering the cafe, their expressions cold and calculating. Alex bolted for the back door, with James and Emily close behind. As they raced through the narrow alleyways, James could hear the men shouting and the sound of footsteps closing in. They reached Emily's car, breathless and terrified. Emily quickly started the engine, and they sped away, leaving the men behind. James glanced at Alex, who was pale and shaking in the back seat. We'll keep you safe, Alex. You did the right thing. Alex nodded, tears of relief in his eyes. I just want this nightmare to end. Emily drove through the city streets, her face set with determination. We have what we need now. It's time to take Martin down and bring justice to all those children. James held the flash drive tightly, knowing it was the key to unraveling the entire network. The tension in the car was thick, but there was also a sense of hope. They were getting closer to the truth, and with every step, they were one step closer to ending the nightmare that had consumed so many innocent lives. The journey ahead was still fraught with danger, but James and Emily were ready to face it head-on. They had the evidence, they had the determination, and now they had a new ally in Alex. The fight against Martin and his network was far from over, but they were ready for whatever came next. James and Emily sat in the dimly lit library of his mansion, poring over the data Alex had provided. The room was silent except for the occasional rustling of papers and the distant ticking of a grandfather clock. The weight of the information they had uncovered hung heavily in the air. Emily glanced up from her laptop, her brow furrowed in concern. James, this is bigger than we thought. Martin's network spans multiple states and involves several high-profile individuals. Exposing them will be dangerous. James nodded, his jaw set with determination. We have to do it, Emily. For Lucas, and for all the other children affected by this. Just then, a shadow moved outside the window, catching Emily's eye. She tensed, her instincts alert. James, did you see that? James turned, but the shadow was gone. What did you see? Someone was out there, Emily whispered, her voice tinged with fear. James quickly stood, moving to the window and peering out into the darkness. He couldn't see anyone, but a deep sense of unease settled over him. We need to be careful. They might already know we're onto them. The next day, James and Emily decided to visit Detective Harris to hand over the evidence. As they left James's house and got into his car, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced around, noticing a black SUV parked a few houses down, its windows tinted. James, that SUV has been there since last night, Emily said, her voice tense. James glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression darkening. Let's take a detour. See if they follow us. They drove through the winding streets of the city, taking unexpected turns and doubling back. The SUV stayed with them, maintaining a discreet distance. The tension in the car was palpable as James and Emily exchanged worried glances. They're definitely following us, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. We need to lose them. Hold on. He took a sharp turn down a narrow alley, the tires screeching as they sped through the tight space. The SUV followed, gaining on them. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she looked back, the vehicle looming ominously behind them. James, they're getting closer. Emily shouted, her fear escalating. James pushed the accelerator, weaving through traffic as they emerged onto a busy street. The SUV struggled to keep up, but the pursuit continued. James took another sharp turn, entering a labyrinth of alleyways and side streets, hoping to shake their pursuers. Finally, they burst out onto a deserted industrial area, the sound of their car echoing off the empty buildings. James pulled over, cutting the engine and turning off the lights. They sat in tense silence, their breathing heavy, waiting to see if the SUV would find them. After several agonizing minutes, the SUV roared past the entrance to the industrial park, missing their hiding spot. James and Emily exhaled in relief, their bodies relaxing slightly. We need to get to Harris, James said, restarting the car. "But we have to be more careful. They know we're onto them, and they won't stop until they silence us." As they made their way to Harris's location, James took back roads and less traveled paths, constantly checking the mirrors for any signs of pursuit. They arrived at a small, nondescript office building where Harris was waiting for them in a secure room. "Harris, we were followed," James said urgently as they entered. "They know we're getting close." Harris frowned, his expression grave. "We need to act fast. Give me the evidence, and I'll start the process of bringing them down. But you two need to go into hiding until this is over." Emily handed over the flash drive, her hands still trembling. "What about Lucas? He's still at the orphanage." "We'll arrange for his protection," Harris assured them. "But you need to stay out of sight. They'll come after you with everything they've got." James and Emily nodded, their resolve unshaken despite the fear that gripped them. "We'll do whatever it takes," James said. "Just make sure Lucas is safe." As they left the office, Harris's words echoed in their minds. The danger was real, and their lives were now at risk. They had stepped into a world of shadows and secrets, where every move could be their last. But they were determined to see this through, no matter the cost. Driving to a safe house provided by Harris, James and Emily felt the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The fight against Martin and his network had escalated, and the stakes were higher than ever. But with each other to lean on, they knew they could face whatever dangers lay ahead. The journey was far from over, and the most perilous part was just beginning. In the dimly lit safe house, James and Emily sat across from each other at a worn wooden table, the air thick with anticipation and tension. Harris had provided them with a small, secure location where they could lay low while he processed the evidence. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, adding to the atmosphere of unease. Emily's laptop sat open between them, displaying the latest findings from Harris's investigation. She leaned forward, scrolling through the data, her brow furrowed in concentration. James watched her intently, his heart pounding in his chest. "Emily, what did you find?" James asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes meeting James's with a mix of disbelief and hope. "James, you need to see this." Harris managed to trace some of the documents back to a private clinic. It appears that Martin's network wasn't just involved in illegal adoptions, they were also conducting experiments. James's eyes widened in shock. "Experiments? What kind of experiments?" Emily hesitated, clearly struggling with the enormity of the revelation. They were experimenting with cloning and genetic manipulation. According to these files, Lucas he's a clone, James. A clone of Daniel. James felt the room spin, the weight of the revelation nearly overwhelming him. A clone? How is that even possible? Why would they do this? Emily's voice was steady, though filled with sorrow. "It looks like Martin's syndicate was funded by wealthy individuals who wanted to exploit genetic science for their own purposes. Lucas was one of several children created, and then placed into the adoption system to cover their tracks." James's mind raced, the implications of this discovery crashing down on him. "So, Lucas, he's Daniel, but he's also not. He's a completely separate person, but with Daniel's DNA." Emily nodded, her eyes filled with empathy. "Yes, and it explains why Lucas has those memories. It's likely that some of Daniel's neural pathways were somehow transferred or replicated. That's why Lucas remembers things that only Daniel would know." Tears welled up in James's eyes as he processed this information. But why would they abandon him? If he was so important to their experiments, why leave him at the orphanage? Emily's expression darkened. It seems like the project was shut down abruptly. There are indications that some of the key players got cold feet or faced external pressures. Lucas and the other children were seen as liabilities, so they were placed into the system and forgotten. James clenched his fists, a mix of anger and sorrow coursing through him. "We need to get Lucas out of there. He deserves to know the truth, and he deserves a chance at a normal life." Emily reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on James's. "We'll make sure he's safe, James, but we need to be careful. Martin and his network won't take kindly to us exposing their secrets." At that moment, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Both of them tensed, exchanging wary glances. Emily reached for the gun Harris had provided, her fingers wrapping around the grip as she nodded to James. "Who is it?" James called out, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "It's Harris," came the muffled reply. "Let me in. We need to talk." Emily kept the gun ready as James unlocked the door, allowing Harris to enter. The detective's face was grim, his eyes scanning the room before he spoke. "We've confirmed the information," Harris said, closing the door behind him. "Lucas is indeed a clone of your son, James. But there's more. Martin knows we're closing in on him. He's getting desperate." James felt a surge of determination. "What do we do now?" Harris placed a folder on the table, filled with more documents and photographs. "We need to bring this to the authorities, but we have to move fast. Martin is likely to make a move soon, and we can't afford to let him slip away." Emily looked at the folder, then back at Harris. "What about Lucas?" "We've arranged for his protection," Harris assured them, "but we need to get him out of the orphanage and into a safe place as soon as possible. He's the key to bringing this whole operation down." James nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Let's do it. Let's bring him home." The plan was set into motion with precision and urgency. They coordinated with Harris's team to extract Lucas from the orphanage, ensuring his safety and preparing him for the truth about his origins. As James and Emily prepared to leave, James took one last look at the photograph of Daniel on his phone. The journey ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. They were closer than ever to bringing justice to Lucas and all the other children affected by Martin's twisted experiments. The battle was far from over, but James was ready to face whatever came next, with Emily by his side and Lucas's future in their hands. James sat at the kitchen table in the safe house, his fingers tapping anxiously against the wood. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the laptop in front of him. Emily sat across from him, her eyes focused on the screen as she scrolled through the documents and evidence they had gathered. The atmosphere was tense, filled with a sense of urgency and determination. "Emily, we have to stop this," James said, his voice firm. "We can't let other families go through what I did. We need to expose Martin and his entire network." Emily looked up, her eyes meeting James's. "I agree, but we need to be strategic about this. If we move too quickly, we could lose everything. Martin has connections, resources. We need to be careful." James nodded, his expression resolute. "What's our plan?" Emily took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "First, we need to compile all the evidence we have into a comprehensive report. We'll use the documents Alex gave us, the data from Harris, and any other information we can find. Once we have everything organized, we'll contact a trusted journalist who can help us get the story out." James leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Who do you have in mind?" Emily smiled slightly. "There's a journalist I know, Sarah Thompson. She's known for her investigative work and has exposed several high-profile cases of corruption. She has the credibility and the platform we need." James nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "Okay, let's do it. But we need to be prepared for the fallout. Martin won't go down without a fight." Emily's expression turned serious. "We need to consider our safety. Harris has already arranged protection for Lucas, but we need to ensure that we're also protected. We should set up safe communication channels and have escape plans in place." James agreed. "I'll make sure the house is secure and we have everything we need. But we can't let fear stop us. We owe it to those children and their families." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. James and Emily worked tirelessly, compiling evidence, drafting reports, and preparing their strategy. The tension in the safe house was palpable as they reviewed each piece of evidence, ensuring that everything was airtight. One evening, as they sat surrounded by stacks of papers and documents, Emily looked up from her laptop. "James, we need to talk about the risks." James stopped what he was doing and looked at her, his expression serious. "What do you mean?" Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. "Going public with this information is dangerous. Martin's network is extensive, and they won't hesitate to silence us if they feel threatened. We need to be prepared for that." James felt a surge of determination. "I know the risks, Emily, but we can't let that stop us. If we don't do this, more children will suffer. More families will be torn apart. We have to be brave." Emily nodded, her eyes filled with resolve. You're right, but we need to be smart too. We should inform Harris about our plan and coordinate with his team to ensure we have backup if things go wrong. James agreed. I'll call him now. We need all the support we can get. He picked up his phone and dialed Harris's number. The detective answered on the first ring, his voice gruff but reassuring. James, what's the status? We're almost ready, James replied, but we need your help. We're planning to go public with the evidence, and we need to ensure our safety and the safety of everyone involved. Harris was silent for a moment before replying. I'll have my team on standby. We'll monitor the situation closely and provide protection as needed. Just make sure you have everything ready before you go to the press. James thanked him and hung up, turning to Emily. Harris is on board. We're not alone in this. Emily smiled, a sense of relief washing over her. Good. Now let's finalize everything. We need to be ready to move at a moment's notice. The night before they planned to go public, James and Emily sat together, reviewing the final details of their plan. The air was thick with anticipation and anxiety, but also with a sense of purpose. Are you ready for this? Emily asked, her voice soft but strong. James took a deep breath, looking into her eyes. As ready as I'll ever be. This is for Lucas and for all the other children. We have to see this through. Emily nodded, her resolve mirroring his. We will, James. We're doing the right thing. As they prepared for the day ahead, a quiet determination settled over them. They knew the risks, but they also knew the importance of their mission. Together, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in their quest for justice and truth. The night was heavy with tension as James, Emily, and a team of police officers led by Detective Harris approached the Boston Children's Home. The moon cast an eerie glow over the building, highlighting its imposing structure. The air was thick with anticipation, every breath laden with the weight of what was about to unfold. James felt his heart pounding in his chest as he tightened his grip on the flashlight in his hand. Beside him, Emily's face was a mask of determination, her eyes reflecting the same resolve that burned within him. Harris signaled for the team to move forward, his expression grave but resolute. They approached the main entrance, moving swiftly but silently. Harris gestured to one of his officers, who expertly picked the lock, allowing them entry. The door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit corridors of the orphanage. James felt a surge of memories wash over him, but he pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand. Stay close and stay quiet, Harris whispered, his voice barely audible. We don't know how many are inside. They moved through the corridors, their footsteps echoing softly against the walls. As they approached the administrative wing, they heard voices. Harris raised his hand, signaling for the team to stop. They listened intently, catching snippets of conversation. We need to move the children tonight. They're on to us, a man's voice said, laced with urgency. Martin will handle it. Just make sure everything is ready, another voice replied, calm and authoritative. James's blood boiled. Martin was here. He exchanged a tense glance with Emily, who nodded, her eyes steely with resolve. Harris motioned for the team to advance. They moved quickly, bursting into the room where the voices were coming from. The sight that greeted them was chilling. Martin stood at the center, surrounded by his associates, his face a mask of cold detachment. He looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his features before it was replaced by a sneer. James Foster, Martin said, his voice dripping with disdain. I should have known you'd come meddling. Shut it down, Martin, Harris commanded, stepping forward with his weapon drawn. It's over. Martin's eyes narrowed. You think you can just walk in here and stop us? You're too late. James stepped forward, his anger boiling over. We have all the evidence we need to bring you down. Your network, your experiments, all of it. It's over. Martin laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the room. You have no idea what you're dealing with. There are forces at play here that you can't even begin to comprehend. Before anyone could react, one of Martin's associates lunged at Harris, knocking the gun from his hand. Chaos erupted as the officers engaged in a fierce struggle with Martin's men. James and Emily found themselves in the thick of the melee, fighting desperately to subdue their opponents. James caught sight of Martin, trying to slip away amidst the chaos. With a burst of adrenaline, he chased after him, determined not to let him escape. Martin darted down a narrow hallway, leading James deeper into the labyrinthine orphanage. "James, be careful," Emily shouted. Struggling with one of Martin's henchmen, James pursued Martin, his heart pounding in his ears. They reached a dead end, and Martin turned to face him, a look of pure hatred in his eyes. "You think you can stop me, Foster? You're just one man." James squared his shoulders, his voice steady. "I'm not alone, and I will stop you." With a roar of rage, Martin lunged at James, and they grappled fiercely. The fight was brutal, each blow fueled by years of pain and anger. James felt himself weakening, but refused to give up. He thought of Lucas, of all the children who had suffered because of Martin's cruelty, and found the strength to fight on. Finally, with a powerful surge, James overpowered Martin, pinning him to the ground. He glanced up to see Emily and Harris entering the hallway, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. "It's over, Martin," Harris said, his voice firm. "You're under arrest." As the police secured Martin and his associates, James felt a wave of exhaustion and relief wash over him. Emily approached, her face softening as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, James. It's over." James nodded, feeling the weight of the past few months lift from his shoulders. "We did it, Emily. Together." They walked back through the orphanage, the halls now filled with the sounds of police securing the scene and ensuring the safety of the children. James felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight was over, and justice had been served. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, James looked up at the sky, the stars shining brightly above. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. The journey had been long and arduous, but they had emerged victorious. And with Emily by his side, he knew they could face whatever the future held. The aftermath of the confrontation was a flurry of activity. Police officers moved through the orphanage, securing the premises and ensuring the safety of the children. James and Emily stood outside, catching their breath as the reality of what they had accomplished began to sink in. The night air was cool, and the sounds of sirens and hurried voices filled the silence. Suddenly, a shout from inside the building broke their momentary respite. "We've found them!" an officer yelled, his voice echoing through the corridors. James and Emily exchanged a look, their hearts pounding with renewed urgency. They rushed back into the orphanage, following the sound of the officer's voice. The scene they encountered was both heart-wrenching and hopeful. In a large room, children of various ages were huddled together, their faces a mix of fear and confusion. Among them, James's eyes quickly found Lucas. The boy was sitting quietly, his eyes wide with uncertainty, clutching a small, stuffed animal tightly. "Lucas," James called, his voice breaking with emotion. Lucas looked up, his eyes lighting up with recognition and relief. "Mr. Foster!" he cried, scrambling to his feet and running towards James. James dropped to his knees, catching Lucas in a tight embrace. Tears streamed down his face as he held the boy close, feeling the weight of the past few months lift off his shoulders. "You're safe now, Lucas. You're safe," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Emily stood nearby, watching the reunion with tears in her eyes. She knelt beside James, placing a comforting hand on Lucas's shoulder. "We're here, Lucas. You're going to be okay." Lucas looked up at them, his eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "I knew you'd come for me," he said softly, his voice trembling. James smiled through his tears. "I promised, didn't I? And I always keep my promises." As the officers began to lead the other children out of the room, James and Emily stayed close to Lucas, ensuring he felt safe and secure. The other children looked to them with a mix of curiosity and hope, their own fears beginning to ease as they realized they were being rescued. "What's going to happen to us?" a young girl asked, her voice small and uncertain. Emily smiled gently at her. "You're going to be taken care of. We'll make sure you're all safe and find you good homes." The children nodded, some of them starting to smile, their fears slowly melting away. The officers moved efficiently, guiding the children out of the building and into waiting vehicles that would take them to safe locations. As they stepped outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the scene. James, Emily, and Lucas stood together, watching as the children were loaded into the vehicles, their futures now filled with hope and possibility. One of the officers approached, his face kind and reassuring. "We've contacted Child Protective Services. They'll make sure all the children are placed in safe, loving homes. You did a great thing here tonight." James nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "Thank you. We couldn't have done it without you." The officer smiled and turned to leave, giving them a moment of privacy. James looked down at Lucas, his heart swelling with pride and love. "You're a brave boy, Lucas. I'm so proud of you." Lucas hugged James tightly, his small body trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Foster, for everything." Emily joined the embrace, wrapping her arms around both of them. "We're a team, Lucas, and we'll always be here for you." As the sun continued to rise, bathing them in its warm light, James felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long and fraught with danger, but they had made it through together. Lucas was safe, the children were rescued, and Martin's network had been dismantled. They stood there for a while, soaking in the moment, knowing that while there were still challenges ahead, they had faced the worst and come out stronger. James looked at Emily and Lucas, feeling a renewed sense of purpose and hope. "Let's go home," he said softly, knowing that wherever they went, as long as they were together, they would always find their way. The days following the raid on the orphanage were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. The authorities were deep into their investigation, piecing together the vast web of Martin's network. James, Emily, and Lucas had returned to the relative safety of James's home, but the emotional toll of recent events weighed heavily on them. James found himself in his study late one evening, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of a desk lamp. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a large window overlooked the garden where the moonlight cast long shadows. He stared at a photograph of Sarah and Daniel on his desk, the memories flooding back with a force that left him breathless. Emily knocked gently on the door before entering. She carried 2 mugs of steaming tea, her face reflecting concern and understanding. "Thought you might need this," she said softly, setting a mug down in front of James. "Thanks," James replied, his voice tinged with exhaustion. He took a sip, the warmth offering a small comfort. Emily settled into a chair across from him, her eyes never leaving his face. "You've been through a lot, James. How are you holding up?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's been overwhelming. I thought finding Lucas and exposing Martin would bring closure, but it's brought up so many old wounds." Emily nodded, her expression sympathetic. "It's natural to feel that way. You've faced incredible loss and trauma. It's not something that just goes away." James looked down at his hands, his mind drifting back to the accident that had taken his family. "I keep thinking about Sarah and Daniel. The guilt is always there, like a shadow I can't escape." "James," Emily said gently, leaning forward, "you've carried this burden for so long. What happened to Sarah and Daniel was a tragic accident. It wasn't your fault." James's eyes filled with tears as he looked at Emily. "But I was driving, Emily. I should have been more careful. I should have protected them." Emily reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You did everything you could. Sometimes, things happen that are beyond our control. Holding on to that guilt isn't fair to you or to their memory." James took a deep breath, the tears spilling over. "I know you're right. It's just so hard to let go. But seeing Lucas, being able to save him and those other children, it's given me a sense of purpose I haven't felt in a long time." Emily squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with warmth and compassion. "You've made a difference, James. You've turned your pain into something positive. That's a huge step towards healing." James nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "I want to keep helping. I want to ensure that no other family has to go through what I did. But I also know I need to find a way to forgive myself." Emily smiled, her expression encouraging. "Forgiveness is a journey, James. It takes time, but you're already on the right path. You have so much love and strength within you. Use that to heal and to continue making a difference." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. James felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He knew the road to redemption and self-forgiveness would be long, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. "Thank you, Emily," he said softly, "for everything. I don't know what I'd do without you." Emily's eyes sparkled with emotion. "You're never alone, James. We're in this together." As they finished their tea, the mood in the room shifted from somber to hopeful. James felt a renewed sense of determination. He would continue to fight for justice, not just for Lucas, but for all the children and families affected by Martin's heinous acts. That night, as James lay in bed, he looked out at the moonlit garden and felt a sense of peace. The scars of his past were still there, but they no longer defined him. He had found a way to honor his family's memory by protecting and helping others. And with Emily by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey of healing and redemption was just beginning, but James was ready to embrace it with an open heart and a determined spirit. The future held promise, and he was prepared to walk towards it, one step at a time. In the months following the dismantling of Martin's network, James Foster's life took on a new direction. His home, once a place of sorrow and isolation, was now filled with laughter and hope. Lucas had become a permanent part of his life, and the bond they shared had grown stronger with each passing day. The echoes of the past were still there, but they were now interwoven with the promise of a brighter future. James stood in his study, gazing out the window at the garden bathed in morning sunlight. It was a serene moment, one that allowed him to reflect on how far he had come. The house was filled with the sounds of life. Emily chatting in the kitchen, Lucas playing with a new set of model rockets. It was a stark contrast to the silence that had once pervaded these walls. As he turned away from the window, his eyes fell on the plans spread out on his desk. They were blueprints for the Foster Foundation, a new initiative he had been working on tirelessly with Emily and a team of dedicated individuals. The Foundation's mission was to support families and children affected by illegal adoption networks and human trafficking, providing them with the resources and legal aid they needed to rebuild their lives. Emily entered the study, a warm smile on her face. "Good morning, James. Ready for the big day?" James returned her smile, feeling a surge of excitement. "More than ready. I still can't believe how far we've come." Emily joined him at the desk, looking over the plans. "You've done something incredible here, James. The Foster Foundation is going to change so many lives." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just me. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Emily. You've been my rock through all of this." Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with pride. "And you've been an inspiration to everyone around you. Your resilience, your dedication, it's remarkable." Just then, Lucas burst into the room, his face lit up with excitement. "Mr. Foster, are we really going to the opening ceremony today?" James laughed, scooping Lucas into his arms. "Yes, we are. And I want you to be there with me, every step of the way." The drive to the new Foster Foundation building was filled with anticipation. The building itself was a symbol of hope and renewal, its modern design standing as a testament to the future they were building. As they arrived, they were greeted by a crowd of supporters, families, and children who had been impacted by their work. James stepped up to the podium, looking out at the faces of those who had come to celebrate this milestone. He took a deep breath, feeling a swell of emotion. "Thank you all for being here today. The Foster Foundation is not just a building. It's a promise that we will stand together against injustice, that we will fight for those who cannot fight for themselves, and that we will provide hope to those who have lost it." The crowd erupted in applause, their faces reflecting the hope and gratitude that James felt in his heart. He continued, his voice strong and clear. "This foundation is dedicated to my wife, Sarah, and my son, Daniel. Their memory lives on in the work we do, and their legacy is one of love and compassion. We will honor them by making a difference in the lives of others." As James concluded his speech, he felt a sense of peace and fulfillment. He had found a new purpose, one that allowed him to transform his pain into a force for good. Emily and Lucas stood by his side, their support unwavering. After the ceremony, James walked through the building, meeting with families and hearing their stories. Each one was a reminder of why they had fought so hard and why they would continue to fight. He watched as Lucas interacted with other children, his laughter filling the room. It was a sound that brought joy to James's heart. Emily joined him, her eyes shining with pride. "You've created something truly special here, James." He smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. "We've created something special, Emily. This is just the beginning." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the foundation, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The scars of the past were still there, but they were now a part of his journey, a journey that had led him to this moment. He had found a way to honor his family's memory by helping others, and in doing so, he had found healing and redemption. The future was filled with promise, and James was ready to embrace it. With Emily and Lucas by his side, he knew that together, they could overcome any obstacle and continue to make a difference in the world. The legacy of the Foster Foundation was just beginning, and it was a legacy built on love, justice, and hope. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe, like, and comment, and check out the next story.